Okay, I am back today for Bloody Elbow, joined by the Outlaw Dan Hardy to talk about some big topics from the MMA world. Dan, it feels like the PFL has been like, apart from that Dubai event, a little bit of a couple months period to sort some things out for the year ahead, and now it feels like we're getting to the period where it's going to be events every week. You flying here, there, and everywhere. So, how are you feeling about the 2025 calendar that you've got ahead of you?
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I agree. It feels like we've been in a bit like of a hibernation over the winter months. But I got a little trip to San Francisco in to record the bracket announcement show, and that kind of felt like the beginning of the year. We've been working hard on the PFL Europe events coming up as well. But yeah, out to Florida soon and into the sun and four back-to-back events and the new format I think is going to be really exciting. Just kind of generally it's going to be a faster paced show. It's going to be more interesting for the fans, I think, and I'm certainly excited for some of these matchups.
You mentioned the PFL Europe there. I wanted to start by talking about, I think, probably the guy who's the most talked about guy in PFL right now, Paul Hughes. And I know that you said pretty openly about the AJ McKee fight that you felt that that was a little bit too soon. He went out there and did what he did, and then goes in there and has a great performance against Usman, even though he doesn't get the win. It felt like people wanted to see the Usman rematch. That didn't end up happening, which I think is fair considering Usman might not be around for a few months still. But when you find out, Paul was going to be fighting against Bruno Miranda, we've seen it happen so many times in MMA where the narrative is, well, he just beats this guy, and then there's this thing to look forward to. It is a risk, even though I know that people rate Paul as a tremendous talent, and we've seen that. But give me your thoughts on this matchup with Miranda and how much of a risk it could be to this Usman fight.
Yeah, look, it is a risk. There's no doubt about it. Bruno Miranda was, when we were discussing opponents for Paul, Miranda was one of the few that I'd put forward as like, look, this is going to be a real tough test for him because Miranda's game, he feels like he's kind of been pushed to one side a little bit, I think, and I feel like, he's looking at this fight as not only a way of him getting back into the main picture, but also a bit of revenge, for him being the B side here for a young man that's at the beginning of his career, perhaps you could say with Paul. Um, but the reality is, look, whether Paul was waiting around for Usman to give him the rematch, or whether he was looking for a different fight that wouldn't have been quite as challenging for him, I think both of those are quite uninspiring, really, for Paul. Certainly, I think he wants to keep active, and I think if you give him a fight that he doesn't feel threatened by, I just don't think he raises his game to the level that we saw him against AJ McKee and Usman. I mean, really, and we discussed it at the time. I felt like AJ McKee was a massive step up for him. But this is why we love MMA, right? We're always open to be excited, to be surprised, and that was a massive surprise. He really stepped up his game. He did the same thing again for Usman, and it wouldn't make sense for him to then take a massive back step. He needs someone like Bruno Miranda that's going to really, come for his chin. And that's what's also gonna get the fans excited as well, isn't it? So I think it's a great matchup, and I can see on Paul's, I can see Paul's energy around the whole event is he's just excited to be back in front of his home fans again.
Yeah, absolutely. The other name that I feel like we've spent the whole of 2024 talking about, Dakota Ditcheva. We still don't know what's going to be happening with her throughout 2025. There was kind of a buzz lately surrounding her when she was seen kind of in the background of one of the shots of UFC London. People started talking about her. Of course, people have been talking about her a lot lately anyway, but I suppose this is kind of new territory because we haven't really had a scenario yet where you have someone who's really built their name in the PFL attracting that interest from the UFC. We've had a lot of, back and forths, but this is quite new in some respects. Is there, do you think, not necessarily a worry because the PFL will be confident that they'll be able to replicate this, but in having Dakota, who has become arguably the face of the promotion whilst, signing while she was still relatively young in her career, have that move over? Like, I know a lot of people get carried away with there could be this trade and all of these things, but from a baseline level for yourself, is there a little bit of a worry that we've built this person up and then they might go on to something else?
No, I mean, no, it's not certainly not for me. No, no, I mean, anybody that can make such amazing progress with their career, you just want to see them keep making that progress, no matter which direction that's in. One thing that would be a crying shame would be for Dakota to feel in any way kind of slowed down or held back or not challenged. That like this is really where she's going to see the best performances of her career. She's had two incredible years where she's cut through PFL Europe and then, won the PFL season. It was in incredible fashion, beating Tyler Santos along the way. But what I think she needs this year is maybe quite not quite as rigorous a schedule as the last 2 years that she's had. Have a couple of super fights, and I think those fighters are certainly on the roster. And if they're not right now, then they will be very soon. And then kind of see where her future goes. But I think she's the one to watch right now, and for me, probably the pound for pound best female fighter on the planet. Both technically and performance based.
Can I put you on the spot and get a name out of you of someone you want to see Dakota fight this year?
Oh man. Well, I mean, look, I think there's a couple of interesting fights in the bracket. Obviously, in this first round, we're going to get Tyler Santos versus Juliana Velasquez. Like, I feel very much like if Velasquez comes through that and looks very strong, that's a good option for her. I think Kana Watanabe against Jenna Bishop is a really interesting fight as well, and going to be a good grappling match. But if Kana Watanabe comes through that, I would like to see someone else that could potentially challenge Dakota and take her down. And the one fight that we haven't yet seen is Liz Carmouche. But then, if we're going left field, we've also got Amanda Serrano under contract, and I know she's got a big fight coming up, a big rematch coming up. But that's the kind of fight that, the PFL could definitely pull out a left field and, throw it on the same card as Jake Paul versus I don't know whoever else. But you know what I mean? It's like these are the kind of moves that could be made. I think there are lots of options for Dakota. And me personally, I'm always watching the rosters as well and seeing who's moving from one organization to another. And there's a couple of organizations out there that have got fighters right now that I think would be a good fit for our roster. And I do think they're going to be available to us soon. So, MMA is shifting constantly. Let's see what happens in the next few years. But I'm just excited to see her fight again is the biggest takeaway, I guess.
Yeah, I want to switch lanes really quick and talk a little bit about the UFC London event that we had just this past weekend. I know that not necessarily that you've been critical of Leon Edwards in the past, but I do think you've raised some points in the past about sometimes his attitude in fights and things like that. And I think that that's been, it's been quite a big talking point after that loss to Sean Brady. After seeing that, where do you think Leon goes from here? Because it felt like that climb to the top was so long that I would imagine it is, despite the fact he's still right up there, I would imagine it seems quite daunting to him at this moment to have to do that again.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel like, I mean, he's made that climb now. He's always going to have that status as a former UFC champion. And that always keeps him in conversation for big fights. The reality as well is that Leon has stayed very healthy throughout his career. He's not taken as much wear and tear as some of the other guys in the division, perhaps. So I still feel like he's got some time. But the reality is, I think for all of the technical ability that he's got, all of the physical attributes, the speed, the reach, the height, and everything, like the thing that he needs to uncover in himself is the will to chase it, right? And anytime I've criticized a fighter, it's always been because that's been the bit that's been lacking, right? You can see sometimes a fighter doesn't quite want it as much, and I mean, we saw it the other day, didn't we? What was his name? Retired, and he was on the floor and kind of decided during the fight that he'd had enough of it. Can't think what his name is now. It's I don't know. I feel like Leon's got a bit more fight in him, and I think maybe if he goes right, look, we've got 5, 6 fights left in my career. I've got nothing to lose. I've been a UFC champion. Let's go out guns blazing. Let's leave everybody with a this guy and Robbie Lawler would have been an awesome fight. You know what I mean? Because like Robbie Lawler's one of those guys that went out with a bang, in my opinion. He really kind of pushed it towards the end of his career and had a lot of exciting fights. And maybe Leon was just a little bit too precious in his build up to the fight, up to the title. Maybe now it just doesn't matter quite as much, and now he can really kind of start to open up because he's a lethal fighter. He's just got to want to. He's got to want to enjoy putting people away. And I know that's kind of an odd thing to say, but you can sense it in a fighter when they want to hurt somebody and when they don't. And wherever that motivation comes from, that's what Leon needs now.
I want to ask you about a recent social media post from Don Davis saying about the only way that Jon Jones is going to make 50 million is him fighting Francis Ngannou in the PFL. At this point, I think that it's incredibly difficult to predict John's next move. Do you see a future in that an Ngannou fight would interest him for that kind of money? And I suppose the other part to that is, will he fight Tom Aspinall this year, in your opinion? Because it kind of seems like I don't personally see him doing both. I think it might be a case of one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, obviously contractually, I don't think that John has much of a say in it, if I'm honest. Which must be honestly quite frustrating for him to know that there is a big chunk of money on the table elsewhere. But at the same time, I think if you put the 50 million on the table, he would fight either Francis or Tom Aspinall. But unfortunately, he's not in a contract situation where he can fight Ngannou, and no one is going to give him 50 million to fight Tom Aspinall. So my concern is that we don't get either of those fights, and it would be a shame. But at the same time, I also understand it from John's perspective. Ngannou would be a tough fight, but a winnable fight. But like there would be a lot to be gained from that. Whereas Tom Aspinall, he would be he would be the launch pad for Tom Aspinall's superstardom. And I understand why John doesn't want to take that risk, especially for the money that's on the table for him for that fight. It just doesn't make sense. He's got legacy to balance for that person. It doesn't make sense financially.
We've had some pretty crazy crossover fights kind of show up and then disappear over the last couple of years. And whilst I thought Oleksandr Usyk versus Alex Pereira seemed like something that could happen in today's world, Oleksandr Usyk in MMA against Jake Paul is not something that I would have ever seen coming. But I mean this in a way that if it had come from Jake, I would have expected that to happen. But for it to come from Usyk's side is where I was like, there might be something to this because Jake is going to accept that, you would imagine, if the money's right and things like that. What do you think about, could this actually happen? Could Usyk fight in MMA?
Well, look, I know for a fact that Usyk is interested, like legitimately interested in fighting in MMA, and he's the kind of person. He's eccentric enough to have a wrestling skill set, or he's like a brown belt in something like that. You know what I mean? I would imagine he's the kind of person that just happened to pick up a brown belt along the way between fights. He seems like an interesting person that would take to MMA very well. The downside for Jake Paul though is that unless Jake Paul's wrestling is up to par, that's a horrible fight for him in boxing or in mixed martial arts because Usyk's a smart guy with great footwork and he's ambidextrous. I think he would be a problem in mixed martial arts. I think if we see Jake Paul, he's going to be fighting someone that's well into their 40s if it's an MMA fight.
On the topic of people fighting into their 40s, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, I want to get your thoughts on the GFL. And I know that it will come across like PFL's Dan Hardy says this, but the reason I ask you this is because you've spoken a lot about wanting to see some of these older fighters fight in like a veterans league and fight people of a similar age, similar experience in competitive matchups that maybe we weren't seeing before. And through the GFL, I think we're getting quite a lot of that, and it's received quite a lot of criticism, even in the fights where it's two guys who are a similar age, similar experience levels. What's your take on that? Considering I know that it was something you were quite interested in pushing for, but I didn't expect the reaction to necessarily be this harsh, considering what, like I said, it is a lot of guys that are fighting other veterans.
Yeah, look, I'm interested in watching it develop. Anything that is an MMA promotion that's offering opportunities for fighters is always a good thing, as especially if it's regulated and it's, like this is going to be regulated by athletic commissions, so none of these fighters are going to be unfit to compete. And yeah, you're right. The fights that I don't like to see is when it's, Nate Diaz versus Hamzat Chimaev. If it's Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson, I have no problem with that. You know what I mean? Like although I don't know as I necessarily need to see Weidman Rockhold again, like I don't mind it happening. I would much rather watch that than watch, Luke Rockhold versus Poatan. You know what I mean? Because I know what's going to happen in that, and it's going to be ugly watching it. So, like, I don't mind it. I don't mind the fact that these older fighters are getting matched up evenly and they're getting paid well for it. And I'm hoping that off the back of it, they start to develop some talent that is fresh and new and that GFL can really take ownership of. I mean, this seems to me like a classic case of we'll get a bunch of names that so you watch, and then we'll show you some guys that you don't know that you might want to watch in the future. And that's perfectly understandable. I mean, you know, I've talked about masters divisions and fair matchups and all those kind of things. So anything where MMA is being regulated and offered for fighters, I'm all for it. So we'll see what happens with them, but they have my support just like anybody else in MMA does.
Well said as always, Dan. I appreciate your time as always too. All the best with this crazy schedule. I'm sure I'll try and catch up with you at some point when you get a moment in between the constant events and flying here and then over. I can't even say it. That's how fast the travel's going. I appreciate your time, mate, as always.
Yeah, no worries, mate. We'll definitely have a catch up. There'll be a lot going on the next few weeks, so we'll chat again soon.